As the world watches, Israel's move in E1 may not be bold. It may be the final nail in the coffin of peace. But why now? The E1 corridor is not just a patch of land outside Jerusalem. It is the thread that, once pulled, could unravel the entire fabric of what little remains of the two-state vision. For decades, diplomats and negotiators described E1 as the red line, the place that, if settled, would make a contiguous Palestinian state almost impossible. And yet, in early 2025, Israel has moved forward with approving construction there, a move that feels less like bureaucratic planning and more like a calculated strike at the heart of the peace process. The geography explains why. E1 is a 12 square kilometer zone east of Jerusalem, between the massive Israeli settlement of Ma'ale Adudim and the city itself. On the map, it looks like a bottleneck. If Israel builds here, it will stitch Ma'ale Adudim into metropolitan Jerusalem, but at the same time, it will choke off Palestinian movement between the northern and southern parts of the West Bank. For Palestinians, the road to Ramallah in the north and Bethlehem in the south would be severed. East Jerusalem, which they claim as their future capital, would be cut off from the rest of their envisioned state. In short, E1 is the geographic guillotine of the two-state solution. This is why US presidents going back decades treated E1 as untouchable. Bill Clinton warned Israel against construction in E1, seeing it as a direct threat to negotiations. George W. Bush, while more sympathetic to settlements, still pressed Israel to freeze plans. Obama was blunt. Settlement in E1 would be game over for peace. Even Donald Trump, whose administration recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, never gave a green light to E1 construction. The project has been proposed, frozen, revived, shelved, and quietly prepared, but never before has it advanced to this point.
And yet, Netanyahu has now crossed that line. Why? Part of the answer lies in Israel's domestic politics. Netanyahu, weakened by corruption trials and facing growing unrest over judicial reforms, leans heavily on ultranationalist coalition partners. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, represent settler constituencies that see E1 not just as desirable, but as essential to their ideological project of annexation. For them, building an E1 is not about housing. It's about hammering a stake through the heart of Palestinian sovereignty. Netanyahu, cornered and calculating, gives them what they demand, and buys himself time. Another part of the answer is timing. With the United States consumed by an election year, Washington's bandwidth is thin. President Biden has issued quiet warnings but avoided confrontation, wary of alienating pro-Israel voters at home. The State Department speaks of deep concern, but stops short of concrete action. Trump's re-entry into the presidential race only adds uncertainty. Palestinians fear a second Trump term could embolden Israel further, while Israeli leaders sense that now, in this window of distraction, they can act with limited pushback. Meanwhile, the Palestinians themselves are in disarray. The Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, is paralyzed and deeply unpopular. Hamas, weakened in Gaza after years of blockade and wars, cannot extend authority into the West Bank. The absence of a unified Palestinian voice makes it easier for Israel to move forward without fearing coordinated resistance. But there's another layer: the people who already live in the E1 zone. Several Bedouin communities, including the Jahalin tribe, reside there in makeshift homes and tents. For years, Israel has tried to relocate them, arguing their presence is illegal. Human rights groups warn that E1's construction would mean their forced displacement, what Palestinians call a slow-motion expulsion. This isn't just about future maps, it's about immediate lives.
And so we reach the contradiction. Israel insists E1 is about natural growth from Ma'ale Adumim, which already houses more than 40,000 settlers. But critics argue natural growth is a euphemism. The real aim is strategic control. Once Ma'ale Adumim is linked to Jerusalem, Israel achieves an irreversible fact on the ground: permanent dominance over the corridor that decides the future of two peoples. This puts the international community in a bind. The European Union has long described E1 as a fatal blow to peace efforts. Arab states that joined the Abraham Accords, such as the UAE and Bahrain, justified normalization by promising Palestinians would not be abandoned. Now they face awkward questions from their own citizens. If E1 kills the two-state solution, what is left to defend? Jordan, whose stability depends on the fragile status of Jerusalem, views the move as a direct threat to its monarchy's custodianship of holy sites. Which brings us back to the larger question. Is this about leverage or finality? Is Netanyahu advancing E1 to extract concessions in some future negotiation, or is he closing the book entirely on the two-state framework? That uncertainty is what makes this moment so explosive, because approving E1 doesn't just redraw maps, it redraws the possible futures of the conflict. If Palestinians lose even the illusion of statehood, what replaces it? A single state where millions live without equal rights? A permanent cycle of violence fueled by despair? Or a reshuffling of alliances that destabilizes the broader Middle East? We are left staring at a chessboard where every move feels like a trap. The settlers celebrate, Netanyahu buys survival, Palestinians lose another piece of land. But the world sees something else. A potential point of no return. And here's the chilling part. If E1 is truly the final nail in the two-state coffin, then what comes next may not be peace's end, but something darker, more dangerous, and far harder to control.
Think about the phrase, point of no return. It's not just dramatic language. In conflicts, there are certain acts that shut doors forever. If construction in E1 goes ahead, that door is the two-state solution. And once it's closed, the entire conflict shifts into a far more unstable reality. For Palestinians, the consequences are existential. If a contiguous state becomes geographically impossible, then the argument changes. They are no longer debating how to draw borders. They are debating whether to fight for equal rights within a single state dominated by Israel, or to accept fragmented autonomy without sovereignty. Neither path is stable. Full rights would challenge Israel's identity as a Jewish state. Enclaves without rights would fuel anger, protests, and possibly new waves of violence. When people feel there is nothing left to lose, history shows they often choose confrontation. Now shift the lens to the wider Arab world. The Abraham Accords promised a new Middle East, where Arabs and Israelis would trade, innovate, and cooperate. But this promise was always tied to the quiet assurance that Palestinians would not be completely abandoned. E1 cracks that facade. In the Gulf, governments like the UAE and Saudi Arabia face rising pressure from their own citizens to respond. Jordan, with its majority Palestinian population, is already alarmed. King Abdullah has warned of red lines before, and this time, the red line is right at his doorstep. For Europe, it faces its own dilemma. Brussels has called settlements illegal for decades, but rarely backed words with real consequences. If E1 goes forward, the EU will either have to escalate, perhaps through trade restrictions, or reveal its inability to defend international law. Either choice is costly. Push too hard and risk confrontation with Washington. Do nothing and lose credibility on the world stage. For a continent already strained by the war in Ukraine and its economic struggles, this is not a comfortable position.
And then comes the United States. Washington's claim to be a neutral peace broker has been eroding for years. Under Trump, recognition of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights tilted the balance heavily. Under Biden, the White House has tried to reset, but with little leverage. If the US fails to act on E1, its credibility sinks further. And in a multipolar world, power vacuums never last long. Russia, already courting influence in Syria and Iran, could exploit the moment. China, eager to project itself as a new kind of mediator, might step in, using E1 as proof that the West talks about peace while enabling its collapse. This is where the E1 approval stops being a local issue and becomes part of the global chessboard. Israel's decision could weaken US influence in the region, strain European unity, and force Arab states into choices they wanted to avoid. And in that shifting environment, alliances may be rewritten in ways nobody can fully predict.
But here's the twist. For some Israeli leaders, this may be the point. They argue the two-state solution was always a fantasy. By moving forward in E1, they don't just bury it, they force the world to adapt to a new paradigm. One state, controlled by Israel, with Palestinians given limited autonomy. Outrage today is the price for permanence tomorrow. The gamble is that eventually the world adjusts. After all, many illegal settlements eventually became facts on the ground that no government reversed. But permanence in the Middle East is rarely permanent. The Nakba of 1948 still fuels Palestinian identity nearly 80 decades later. E1 could become the new rallying cry, the new symbol of betrayal and dispossession. And symbols have power. They inspire movements, shape generations, and can turn quiet despair into explosive resistance.
So, we come back to the question, is E1 a trap or a miscalculation? It traps Palestinians between hopeless futures. It traps Arab leaders between their rhetoric and their economic interests. It traps the West between its values and its alliances. And it may even trap Israel itself between short-term political survival and long-term instability. Because here's the paradox. In securing E1, Israel may believe it gains strength, but strength that rests on the permanent disenfranchisement of millions can become weakness. Governing land is easy. Governing people without hope is not. And if peace is no longer an option, then conflict mutates. It may not look like the wars of the past, but it will carry its own risks. Uprisings, boycotts, international isolation, or even unexpected alliances among those who feel cornered. So is this the final nail in the coffin of peace? Perhaps. But coffins don't always hold closure. Sometimes they bury illusions, only for new realities, raw, dangerous, and unpredictable, to rise in their place. And that is the haunting truth about E1. It may not end the conflict. It may only ensure that the next chapter is darker, harder, and far more difficult to control.